Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this Chamber Low Carbon Live Lunch and Learn. Carbon offsetting, planting trees is not the answer. I'm Chris Gibbons, an Energy and Environmental Advisor with the Chamber Low Carbon Programme, and I'm hosting today's session. We have two great speakers for you today, giving their time and expert insights into the topic area. That's Jack Spees and Chantelle Brandwood. Before I formally hand over, just a little bit of information about Chamber Low Carbon and some housekeeping for the event today. All participants are on mute. If you have any questions, we have a Q&A facility at the bottom of the screen. You can submit your questions at any time throughout the show. And today's session, we'll be picking these questions up at the end after we've had both speakers do their presentations. You may find that your question gets answered along the way. That's no problem. We'll still revisit it and make sure that you're happy with the answers that you've heard and everything's interpreted okay. If you'd like to speak your question, do let us know and I can unmute you, but I'm happy to read on your behalf. We also have a chat function where you can introduce yourself and network. That's at the bottom of your screen next to the Q&A. And today's session is being recorded and will be available to watch again on the Chamber's Low Carbon YouTube channel. Introduction to Chamber Low Carbon for any of us that are new today. We're a European Regional Development Fund programme, and it's in partnership with East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce, North and West Lancashire Chamber of Commerce, Business-Wise Solutions and Boost. We support businesses across Lancashire to go green, save money and reduce their carbon footprint. If you could just move to the next slide for me, Chantelle. Thank you very much. As mentioned, we're an EDRF programme, a £6 million programme that provides a suite of free services to help businesses improve their energy and environmental efficiencies, introduce renewable energy generation and assist them in saving money. And then we go on to slide 3 for me. The programme also helps Lancashire-based businesses that are developing new low-carbon technologies to bring their products to market, facilitate them being manufactured in Lancashire, and to help them find demonstrator sites within the Lancashire region. And now on to the introductions for both of our speakers. As mentioned, we have two people for you today. We have Chantelle Brandwood of Eco Offset, and then we have Jack Spees from the Ribble Rivers Trust. I'm going to reverse the bios. Jack's will be first, and then we'll hand over neatly to Chantelle to get us started with the presentations. Focusing on his passion for the outdoors and the environment, Jack completed an MSc in Conservation and Land Management, commencing a career in the environmental sector. He has applied his expertise in a number of different organisations, most notably the MOD Estates in South West Wales. Jack's passion for rivers and managing the land around them had led him north to the Ribble. Nearly 14 years ago, he joined the Ribble Rivers Trust, initially spearheading a more scientific and evidence-based approach to the work that they do. More recent work has seen Jack lead the Trust strategy to improve rivers and to make them more climate resilient for both wildlife and the public. And now on to Chantelle. She's the founder of Eco Offset, an environmental sustainability consultancy firm. She has certificates in carbon emissions management, reduction and reporting, along with being an IEMA qualified lead environmental auditor. Chantelle's aim is to help businesses reduce their environmental impact and become a force for good. She's passionate about sustainability and believes every single one of us has the ability to make many small, impactful changes to help in the fight against climate change. And I'll now hand over to Chantelle. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for that. I'm just turn my camera off just so that I don't distract myself. There we go. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to chat to you for about 20 minutes. We're going to look at carbon offsetting, obviously, but we're also going to just, before we get into that, talk about why should we care about carbon and how we can manage it. Because if we just go straight into carbon offsetting, we're going to open ourselves up to a bit of scrutiny there. So really wanted to talk about how we offset responsibly and integrate that into our business sustainability strategies. And then obviously Jack's going to touch on how we can do that later on in his section as well. So we're in 2021, we're almost at the end of it now, but it's been a big year for sustainability. We've got COP26, the climate change conference coming up in just a couple of weeks, and the climate crisis is on the news pretty much every day now. At BBC News, Sky News, they've got their own section dedicated to climate change, which is something that you just never thought would even happen even 12 months ago. And the reason that it's such an important year for sustainability is that it's now tipped that we only have 10 years left to try and turn the tide on the situation that we're in at the moment. if we haven't made some big changes by 2030, some of them are going to become irreversible. So this really is the decade for us to get going. We've got limited time left to try and minimise the impact, so we all need to try and get involved and try and take some action together now. So we talk a lot about sustainability, and carbon offsetting is a big part of that. But what does it actually mean? Well, the definition is there for you. It's how we live, all of us today, that can meet our own needs, but doesn't impact on future generations to meet theirs too. Well, are we doing that? Because sometimes it doesn't feel like we are. The science tells us that we're actually using the resources of around 13 planet Earths every single year, but we've only got one. So we really need to think about our behaviours, about how we've lived in the past and what we can do today and how we can impact that. And the younger generations who are going to have to live with a lot of the impacts of how we've lived, they're really wising up as to what they're facing into now. We've got Greta Thunberg, and whether you love her or hate her, you can't deny she's been absolutely amazing for getting the climate crisis onto the front page. Really vocal youth action groups, and that's because they know what they're going to have to deal with, and it's a consequence of how we've lived our lives. And we also have climate inequality, so we're looking at what we might be facing into in the coming years, but there's a lot of people in the undeveloped world that are already dealing with the effects of climate change because of our carbon emissions. And that tends to be the countries that have done the least to cause it. So you get this real big gap between the developed world and the undeveloped world, who's causing the problem and who's actually feeling the effects. But it is going to touch all of us at some point. So if we think about tomorrow's child, so that's my little girl there, Penelope. So when we look at what they're going to be facing into, think about your own child. If you've got son, daughter, any small person that is important to you. And quite shockingly, the effects we're going to look at would affect anybody that's on this call today that's under the age of 30. So some of these changes are really going to come through and start to hit us soon. And compared to the average 60-year-old that's alive today, they're going to experience 30 extreme heat waves. And that's extreme. That's not just what we get at the moment where it's a bit difficult to sleep and the trains might stop running because the tracks have warped a bit. These are extreme heat waves. And they're going to cause droughts, and they're going to cause wildfires, and 3 times more floods and crop failures. And the flooding, which I'm sure Jack will touch on later, seems a bit odd to talk about as we've just talked about heat waves and droughts. But when you get this drought, you get erosion of the soil, your plant life dies, and those are natural flood resources and defences. And that means that crops get ruined, and it leads to more disruption in our food and our supply chain. And you'll have seen in the news this week about people panic buying and empty shelves. We are an island. We're quite vulnerable to where we've built up our supply chains across the world. So this is going to start happening more and more. And it is sometimes down to climate change and the fact that the things we rely on, the food that we need, is simply being disrupted and can't grow. And that inequality gap is going to widen massively. So whatever Penelope and her counterparts are going to deal with, the people that are living in these countries that are feeling the effects today, that's going to be a huge disruption on their life. And we're going to see more refugees because people are having to migrate because they can't find food and water. And that can lead to political unrest and even war. So, climate change and lack of resource, wars have been fought over much less than things about as important as food and water. And think about the petrol stations last week or the week before when we couldn't get petrol. There were people fighting on the forecourts, kicking off with the police. Imagine what that would have looked like if it was people queuing up for water. So this is going to be a really serious situation. It's not just going to be far off and people in Africa that are going to suffer this. This is going to touch on us today. And it's happened in Europe this year. We've seen the floods in Germany, and even here in the UK, we had flash floods in London. Weirdly, the week after, we had a heat wave and the first ever extreme heat warning in the UK that we'd had. So we really are starting to see this unrest. And if we don't adapt our behaviour, we're going to have a much harder time trying to adapt to these new conditions that we're going to have to deal with. So we really do need to act now, because you can't turn off your carbon emissions overnight. Even if we stop doing everything immediately that produced carbon today, we would still see that cumulative heating effect. So we need to all start chipping away and making the small changes that we can. It's not about a handful of us trying to do it perfectly. We need everybody trying to reduce their carbon footprint by maybe 10% where they can. And if we're doing that on a massive collective scale, that's going to have a huge impact. So it is time to really start thinking about what we can do about our carbon. Why carbon? We always talk about carbon. It's a carbon footprint, carbon emissions. This term gets kicked around a lot, and we're obviously going to talk about carbon offsetting. So what is it? The reason it's so important is that carbon emissions are the single most important thing that have caused this climate change. And that has basically been powered by us as a human race. Temperatures have risen since time began, not to be dramatic, but they have. We've always had these temperature fluctuations, but never as quick and never through unnatural causes, such as our industrialization and our revolution, where we've got into this mass consumerism and behavior. So we all really need to have a think about how we can reduce our footprints, because that is going to give us the biggest help to tackle this crisis. So that's why 2021 is so important, because as you can see at the bottom there, we need to cut our emissions by 45%, and we need to do it in this decade. And the average carbon footprint is quite helpful to know, because as I said earlier, everything has a carbon footprint. So whether it's a product, whether it's your business or you as an individual, you can't really think about offsetting your carbon emissions or carbon footprint unless you know what it is. So here in the UK, the average adults, it's estimated that their average carbon footprint is 13 tonnes. Now, if you're a vegetarian and you use a lot of public transport or you cycle, then your carbon footprint is less. But if you eat a lot of meat and dairy and you go on a couple of holidays a year when you can, your carbon footprint is going to be much higher, probably around 20, 21 tonnes. And you can see there that America and Australia, they are much higher than us, but we do have quite similar lifestyles. And that can come down to the energy efficiency within a country. So in the UK, believe it or not, we are quite energy efficient. We've got quite a good renewable source, and the national grid has improved massively. And that's actually reduced our average carbon footprint down from 15 tonnes just 5 years ago. But in America, Australia, they're so huge, they've not quite got the infrastructure there yet, but they will. So it's just a case of utilising technology and efficiencies as that happens. But we touched on inequality earlier. So we're producing the emissions along with other developed countries, and somebody that lives in Malawi has a footprint of 0.2 tonnes, which is barely on the scale. But it's probably them that are dealing with climate change today because of what we've done in the past 100 years. So what we want to see is an average global footprint of each person of around 5 tonnes. So we want the people that have got a really low footprint in Malawi to increase theirs, because we want them to have energy for schools, to build good healthcare infrastructure and transport. But we just need to calm it down a little bit where we are and just really think about our behaviours, how we deal with things at the end of their life chain, and how we can actually impact and chip away at our daily lives without causing, too much of a huge behavioural change, because we don't want this to be overwhelming for people. And it's not just a good thing to do for the planet. We've looked at why it's so important, but most of you on here will be members of the chambers. So for a business point of view, there are massive benefits to be had, because a lot of the people that are coming to you as a customer, they're now looking at companies that have got a really strong sustainability strategy, that are giving back to the community, that look after their staff, look after the environment. So if you can put together a really good policy around CSR and your carbon, that's going to help you with sales as well. So when we talk about carbon offsetting, this is why we need to be really careful about how we do it and how we communicate that to our customers, because this can be a really powerful tool. But when it's done badly, it could actually backfire. So where we start when we're looking at a carbon strategy is we look at quite a clear process. We look to first of all measure our carbon footprint. We then reduce as much as we can, and then we think about offsetting. And it's also important to report and share what you're going to talk about. But if you try and jump to offsetting first, we're not doing it in the spirit of sustainability. We just could potentially be looking for the quick way out. So this 3-step process will help you to do it ethically and for the right reasons. So first of all, when you're measuring, you need to get a real grip on what your carbon emissions are, because you can't look to offset if you don't know where you're starting. So there's that famous saying of you can't manage what you haven't measured. And it is true. You can't look at an offsetting scheme until you know what you need to account for. So once you've looked at your business as a whole, you need to look at your emissions and break them down into scopes 1, 2, and 3. And we're not going to go into massive detail on here. We can touch it in the questions, but generally your emissions of scope 1 and 2 are what you have control over within your business. So the energy that you consume on site, that you burn, or that you purchase will be a scope 1 and 2. If you own any vans or you own any business fleet cars, they would come into scopes 1 and 2. And 3, scope 3 generally focuses on your supply chain. So it would be things that you are buying to come into the business and things that you are producing that are going out and how they're managed at their end of life. And scope 3 makes up a massive portion of your carbon footprint. But it can be quite hard to calculate that. So you definitely need to be looking at your scope 1 and 2 and make as much effort as you can on those scope 3s, because if you go out and say we're carbon neutral, we've offset our scope 1 and 2, and you've ignored scope 3, you're ignoring a huge portion of your business's environmental impact. So get some help with it if you need to, but you should certainly always look for your scope 3s, because that's going to be a massive emerging area. And then you calculate, so you can do that. There's online calculators, you can get support from a consultancy firm, or you can actually look at the address at the bottom there. That's the government's website for their conversion factors. So you can actually do it manually as well with their spreadsheets. So however you do it, you need to get a good measure. And there will be some things in your business that will be hotspots. So if you're a distribution company or you've got a lot of sales reps on the road, that's probably going to be your fleet and your transport. So think about when you measure it, what are the things that you can tackle and what you can break down. And then you think about a base year. So if you're looking at 2020 to start with, that's probably going to be skewed whatever industry you're in, unless you're a logistics company or an online delivery company. So some of the companies that I've worked with, if they're brand new, we've looked at 2019, give an accurate picture, because if you don't know where you're starting, you can't get proper reductions, and you need that data and that evidence to keep you going along the road of sustainability, because this isn't something that you do once. This is something that's a long-term plan, and once you've started, you really want to know where your finish point is and be able to track that as well. And the most important part when we're looking at offsetting is your reduction plan. So you could just measure your carbon footprint and just offset it straight away, but you're almost, as we said, you're paying to pollute. You're just putting a sticking plaster on it. What we want to see is real change, and that offsets are being used responsibly. So we look at how we can reduce our impact as much as possible. And it's better to do this as a team. So yes, you could do it on your own. If you're, if you're a small company, it's easy for one of you to do it because you've got a lot of control, but it's nice if you can all get in there together. It will be quicker, it will be easier, and it will just be more effective. And you break down your plan into targets and give yourself some dates. So look at what you could do in the next 6 months. So could you change to LED light bulbs? Could you put a control on your heating so you've not got the heating on and then all the windows open in the back? So think about what you can do immediately, but then think about, again, the example with the fleet. If you've got 30 cars on the road and you know that you've got them coming up for renewal in the next 2 to 5 years, can you go to hybrid? Can you go to electric at that point? And think about how you can engage your fleet management company in that. And industry sector specific advice. There will always be parts of particular industries that have impacts that another business may not have. So, for example, we work with a lot of veterinary practices that use anaesthetic gases when they're operating on the pets. And some anaesthetic gases, like nitrous oxide, are really potent. So a quick win for them is to change the type of gas that they use and to use a low flow anaesthetic technique. So obviously that's not going to apply to you if you've got an accountancy firm, but there may be something in there that would, such as, can you go digital? We've worked with an insurance company, which obviously uses loads of paper, and they managed to go digital, get 80% of their clients using electric communications, and they cut their carbon footprint by 28 tonnes. So there will be something, whatever industry you're in, that will be able to pick and to be able to reduce. And engage your procurement and your suppliers. So sustainable procurement is a big one that will really impact on your scope 3 as well. So let's have a look at offsets. That's what we're here to talk about. But what is a carbon offset? It's a way that you look at what you're putting out into the atmosphere and balancing it by investing in projects or technology that actually removes CO2. So think of it as a scale, and we talk about carbon neutral. So you're balancing out what you're emitting with what you're conserving or what you're capturing. So if you had a carbon footprint of a business of 100 tonnes and you offset 100 tonnes in a project that was, say, renewable energy, so solar panels, you contributed to those being built and installed, then you would be balancing out your 100 tonnes that you were emitting into the atmosphere. So think of that scale and keeping it at a neutral instead of emitting more. And we call an offset a carbon credit. So you'll hear a lot of people say, oh, carbon credits, this, that. One credit is equivalent to 1 tonne. And a good carbon offset, because there aren't, you know, as with any industry, you have good suppliers and you have not so good suppliers. So a good quality carbon offset should not just look at removing CO2, it should look at how it impacts the local community. Does it benefit the wildlife and the habitat that live there? And does it help people in the area that live there to better themselves in some way? Does it pay the people that work on the project a fair and a living wage? So yes, we're looking at offsetting our carbon, but there are ways that we can do that that align with the Sustainable Development Goals and that encompass a much wider area than just removing CO2. And it's a tool, it's not one thing. This should be a carbon management plan, and you should use it alongside all of the other initiatives that you're implementing, such as, you know, your small things as make sure all your appliances are turned off at night when you're leaving the office, or having that plan to go electric or switch to a renewable energy supplier. But it does give you a way to take responsibility for your impacts immediately. So if you're a business and you are on, well, okay, I'll give you an example of me. I work from home, and we're in a really old cottage which has oil-powered central heating. And obviously that is terrible for the environment, it's fossil fuels, but we know we're going to change that. So in the new year, we're having a heat pump installed. But for the last 6 months, we've been offsetting the impact of that central heating because we know that we can't do anything immediately about it, but we want to take responsibility for what we're using. So when you think of it like that, you've got your plan, you know what you're going to do about it, but if you've got the budget and you want to do something, then it's a really good way for you to give back. There's no financial reward here for you to do carbon offsets. This is about you giving back and being responsible for your business's impact. So use it wisely, make sure that you're not opening yourself up to criticism and just doing it on its own for the wrong reasons. This should be one thing in many that you're doing to help and to become more green as a business. And there's some best practice ways for us to do this. So there are governing bodies out there that will actually check that a project meets the requirements, that it does align with Sustainable Development Goals. They should be transparent. So if you say, I'm investing in this carbon offsetting project, you should be able to find out about everything that you want to know about it. So who's working on it, who has signed it off, what are the terms? Is it going to be checked again in 5 years, 10 years to make sure that it actually still exists? They should be audited. So if you're investing 100 tonnes of carbon into this project, you want to know that that is actually going to take place and that it's still going to be there in 10 years. And what we do is we work with global registries to make sure that when you buy a tonne of carbon or a carbon credit, it's retired in your name or your business's name, and it's not being sold to multiple people, because that has happened in the past, and that's why all this accreditation is coming out now, to try and really hone down and stop that happening. Because if you're offsetting 100 tonnes, you need to know that you're offsetting 100 tonnes and that it's not been sold to somebody else as well. Otherwise, you're not going to have that impact. And these are some of the certifying bodies that we work with. So you've got the United Nations Gold Standard, and you've got the Woodland Carbon Code up there, which Jack's going to touch on in depth later for you as well. So when you're looking for offsets, if you're looking for yourself or your business, try and go with a verified body that will give you that confidence. And when you're talking about it then to your customers and to your team, you can have that confidence that what you've bought into and what you're committing to do and support is actually going to happen. So just to give you a couple of examples of what a project might look like, you have different types of projects. So you have forestry projects where you can protect and conserve areas. You have projects that focus on energy, so you could invest into solar panels, wind turbines, or hydropower dams. But this particular one is called the Katingan project, and it's in Borneo, and it basically means that the landowners there are paid an income from carbon offsets, and it means they don't have to sell it to logging companies, they don't have to sell that land off to potentially be used for something else. And it protects endangered species, and it also protects the soil and the peat that the forest is on, because peat, which I'm sure Jack will touch on, peat is a huge sequester of carbon. So if those forests were to be chopped down, you're losing the trees and the timber, which will release carbon as they're chopped down, and it will also stop obviously storing it. You're losing that habitat and wildlife, and you would also start to release carbon from the peat. So this is a really powerful project. And we've touched on the community aspect of an offsetting one. This project gives finance courses to women that live in the local villages and how to manage their money. Because if their husband died or if they got divorced, women are basically left destitute and they have to look after their children. So they educate women, they provide schools and healthcare. So these sorts of projects, and we talk about a good quality offset, they're not just about the CO2, they have multiple benefits. And a community project, rather than protecting trees, this one here, this provides solar cooking stoves, in particular to a refugee camp. So these stoves are obviously solar powered. So the women and the children in this refugee camp, they don't have to go out and collect timber. So they're not cutting down trees, and then they're not burning the trees to cook with. So it's healthier for them. We're reducing deforestation, we're reducing emissions. And it's safer as well, because in these refugee camps, if they're going out, the kids don't have time to go to school, the women are at risk of violence. So when you're looking at offsets, there's so many ways that you can support these things and reduce CO2, but have a real impact as well on people's lives. So it's important to think about, what are your values as a business? What do your customers respond best to? So when I work with a vet practice, they love all the projects that support the Amazon or the forest, because they want all the pictures of the animals to put on their social media, because that's what their clients buy into. So you have a think about what type of offsets you want to support and where. So I'm focusing on global offsetting here, and we're going to look at UK offset projects shortly with Jack, but it needs to speak to you and it needs to speak to your clients, because this is going to be a focal part of your sustainability strategy. You need to be passionate about it and really care. So this one here is converting degraded lands that have been grazed on for years. So there wasn't a forest here previously, and they're actually going to regenerate this grassland and actually make it into new forestry. So that'll improve the soil health and it'll improve biodiversity again. So there's so many different ways that you can do this. And this is what you'd be looking for when you an offset purchase. So you can see there that this is a certificate from the United Nations. So that's what you want when you're offsetting in a project. If you're going to go out and say, we're a carbon neutral business, you want to be able to show people your certificate. So that obviously that's my company name there, but you want it in your company name. So if you're going to offset with a company, you want to make sure they're going to retire that in your name. So you can put that on your social media, you can put it on your website. You even get a link to the global register so that your clients can go on and see it there in black and white on the internet that you have actually done what you've committed to. So it's all about that transparency and making sure that your clients have got the trust that you're doing what you're saying you're doing. So in case I've not said it enough, this should really be along with offsetting. Has got a fantastic place. It's a brilliant tool, but it needs to be alongside a reduction plan. Otherwise, you're going to get accused of greenwashing and just doing it for the wrong reasons. And it can be such a powerful tool and affect the environment, the people that live there. So don't use it incorrectly, because of what you're doing when you choose to offset, you're making a really powerful statement about what you care about. So do it wisely. And when you've done it, tell people about it. So I love this quote, because what we want is this collective action. When you've done something really bold and taken that step to become carbon neutral, or if you're looking at offsetting your electricity, whatever you're doing, tell people about it. People want to be green. They want to buy from people that are green. But more importantly, it will encourage them to do it too. And that's what we need. We need all of us doing it in small ways to make that big impact over the next 10 years. So that's me. That's a few resources there for you. My details are there. If you've got any questions after this session today, please do get in touch, and a couple of really good books and resources there for you as well. So I'll hand over to Jack now. I think I need to stop sharing. That might be helpful.
Thanks, Chantelle. Just hopefully that's now. Yeah. So thanks again, Chantelle. And I think, you know, hopefully one of the key things that you've taken away is offsetting is not the answer. It is a part of the answer, and it's the end point in your carbon journey. It is about measuring, it is about reducing, and also realizing that it's not just until 2030 we're going to have residual emissions that we need to tackle for decades and decades to come. In terms of 2030, we are just 98 and a half months away from 2030. So hopefully that gives you, further sense of urgency that you need to act now, but do start with that measure and reduce. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about Lancashire Woodland Connect and our carbon offsetting through Lancashire Woodland Connect. Essentially, there are two types of sequestration, which Chantelle's touched on. Carbon offsetting. There's sequestration, where we're removing carbon from the atmosphere, and there's that sort of prevention of emissions. Within the UK, there are only two recognised carbon offsets. That's the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code. The Woodland Carbon Code is a sequestration type of offset. It is planting trees to take carbon out of the air. The Peatland Carbon Code, it does take carbon out of the air, but it's far more about the emissions. In fact, a huge percentage of our carbon emissions as a nation are coming from antigrade peatlands. So improving peatland is absolutely vital to getting our national emissions down. As I said, it's not long until 2030, but we have got a long way to go, and we have to be thinking now about that long-term future, because it takes a long time for sequestration to really kick in. So when we're planting a tree, it's not necessarily going to be sequestering carbon and giving you an offset straight away. Okay, so Lancashire Woodland Connect, essentially we've been doing woodland creation for over a decade, and in sort of 2018-19, things really kicked off. There was a huge groundswell and demand for action on climate change. And that's because we were feeling those effects, as Chantelle referred to. And, when it comes to flooding, to give you an idea, last year, the Ribble set new river record levels at Samsbury near Preston that were higher than the Boxing Day 2015 floods. Other parts of our catchment saw records that hadn't been broken since records began. They were broken twice in 2 weeks. We're really seeing the effects of climate change now. And we're not doing enough to address those effects, but we're not doing enough to stop the effects getting worse. So we really need to get on top of this. and again, as Chantelle's touched on, tackling carbon and tackling climate change can have a lot more benefits than just being able to offset. So we must act now. My sort of favourite quote, you've probably seen that on social media. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. You know, we really need to get that sense of urgency. When we were developing the campaign, we sort of decided to kind of launch it largely because so many organisations, charities, local authorities, businesses were declaring climate emergencies, setting up pathways to net zero, and they didn't really have a plan as to how they were going to do that. They didn't really know where to turn. So our first advice was talk to someone like Chantelle or some of the other consultancies that can help with that measure and reduction, and then come back to us and talk about what we can offer. So in terms of Lancashire Woodland Connect and the campaign, we've done this decade of woodland creation, and I started playing around with some of the numbers. So the IPCC, the Independent Panel for Climate Change, was saying that the UK needed to plant 30 to 50,000 hectares of new woodland every year. Lancashire's 1.2% of the UK, so our fair share is 381 hectares, which is roughly 500,000 trees, and that's a year. Ribble Rivers Trust is one of the biggest deliverers of woodland, deciduous woodland in Lancashire, if not the biggest, and that quantity per year is 13 times our busiest year. So trying to achieve that is almost, it's not achievable. So we decided to kind of review and say, all right, well, let's look at the woodland cover in Lancashire. There's 6%. It should really grow to about 17%. Can we basically instigate something that others will follow and help us to get to that 17%? Now, you might say, hang on a minute, 6% sounds quite low because, you know, when I drive around Lancashire, there's trees everywhere, but actually it's not woodland. You know, we have huge numbers of trees in sort of parkland landscapes, in hedgerows, along roads, but actually the numbers of large woodland or the amount of large woodland is very, very small. So our target, we want to deliver 50 hectares a year for the next decade, so 500 hectares, which will be more than 500,000 trees, which should equate to over 100,000 tonnes of CO2. Depending on how the woodland is designed, it could be as much as 160,000 tonnes of CO2 over the next 100 years. And that is one of the crucial things, that longevity, how long it takes for carbon to be sequestered. And we're really hoping that this is going to inspire others to exceed these targets. And it is. We're already seeing evidence of that. More people joining our campaign, contributing. So beyond carbon, what else will woodlands achieve? Chantelle has touched on quite a few things. It does improve water quality. It can provide buffers. This site is right on the Lancashire border with North Yorkshire on the way to sort of Hellerfield and Long Preston. This was taken about 10 years ago. It's a beautiful, fantastic woodland, and we planted it to provide a buffer from the adjacent land to improve water quality. It stabilizes the soils, it soaks up the nutrients and prevents it getting into the river, which can cause negative impacts to wildlife. It provides shade, and that's a really big thing. You know, we've heard about the extreme temperature events. Well, in a non-extreme temperature event, we monitored a brook called Bashall near Clitheroe, and over a 1 kilometre length, the temperature, where there was no shading, the temperature rose by 9 degrees Celsius. It went from a safe, sensible level for wildlife or aquatic wildlife to a existential threat temperature over 1 kilometre. And we have thousands of kilometres of unshaded habitat across the Ribble. Fish live in trees. No, they really do. But okay, largely the roots of trees in riverbanks and the trailing branches. So planting trees along riverbanks is creating river habitat. It slows the flow. It does contribute to reducing downstream flood risk. Again, it's not the answer on its own, but it is part of the solution. And it does that through the stable, improved soils. So water can percolate into the soil, which is one of our best places to store water. But it also slows the velocity of water as it's flowing overland downstream. It sequesters carbon. Another really important part, 2019, we were hearing about the silent killer, the air quality, which was particulate matter 2.5. The headlines almost flipped in 2020 because with the lockdown, there was so much less vehicles on the road. that we actually saw air quality improve dramatically. And obviously that's now creeping back up as lockdown and sort of restrictions have eased. One of the best ways to take PM 2.5 out of the air, plant trees. They're really good at stripping that particulate matter out of the air and improving the health for people. People love to go to woodlands and recreate, whether that's walking, bird watching, cycling. You know, it's a really popular place. You only have to go to Gisborne Forest on a weekend to realise how popular they are. And they do support physical and mental health. An amazing medical sort of research paper identified that people walking through woodlands, immediately entering woodland, their heart rate reduced. You know, there's a sort of an intrinsic link between people and woodlands. They're a key habitat for biodiversity in this country, but that's creating new habitat for biodiversity, but also really importantly, connecting, you know, linking up our little blocks of woodland here, there and everywhere, and trying to better manage our woodland. And you say, hang on a minute, you're a Rivers Trust. What's your obsession with trees? Why are you so into trees? Well, over the last 5 years, we planted 155,000 trees. And we actually have 200,000 planned in the next 2 years. We had some delays from last year that slowed us down. And this winter, all things being equal, we'll see 140,000 trees planted across Lancashire. And we know that we already have 60,000 planned for next year. More opportunities are coming every day. And we've created the most new deciduous woodland in Lancashire. We've got the skills, the capacity and experience and an evidence-based approach, which I'm just going to touch on very quickly because it's quite complicated. We have a reputation for delivery and we're accountable. We're a charity. We have to operate in line with charity standards. Where are we going to plant all these trees? You know, Lancashire's a big place, but it's not that big, you might say. And that is the fundamental question. So we did have discussions with large landowners, some of the old historic estates, United Utilities, but they're not the solution. We can't plant massive tracts of woodland on their land, but also, will we get the most benefit from just picking one large area and throwing all our trees at it? Well, no, not necessarily. It's about the right trees in the right place. And you've probably heard that phrase, which comes from not to cause other environmental damage. So if you plant woodlands in places where there are breeding wading birds, you can actually reduce the population of breeding wading birds because they don't like trees. But also it's about where do we get the most benefits? And we deliver that through geographical information systems and using really high-end modeling and tools to focus in. And what we found from that work was that small blocks of woodland across the county was going to give us the most benefit. How do we pick those locations? Well, we'll have a quick look at our map. So we take about 300 data sets. These are just sort of 4 of the key ones. And we overlay them, we run various analysis on them, and we come up with this lovely map that looks a bit like it's got measles. So this is the Ribble catchment. We're currently producing this for the rest of Lancashire. And essentially, if we zoom in on one of these spots on the map, you'll see that we have this hatched area here. And we've identified through our tools that if we planted woodland across that entire area, we would have the most benefit within Lancashire to that part of the stream, but also downstream to all those who live, both people and wildlife, below. We've also, and that tool is actually so successful that the Welsh Government have now picked it up and are looking at using that to target their woodland across Wales. And this tool is about how we identify where we'll get the most health benefits from environmental improvements, particularly woodlands. Not surprisingly, it's across East Lancashire and that M65 corridor. And this has been rolled out nationally by the Environment Agency and our national body, the Rivers Trust. It's the first data of its kind. We also use our partners, so we work very closely in partnership to identify places where if we created woodland, we will get better connection between existing habitats. And we can layer all of these maps and then really find those places that are going to hit the greatest benefit. Okay, so I should talk a bit about offsetting and particularly through woodlands. So as I mentioned, there are only 2 codes the UK government recognised, the Woodland Carbon Code and the peatland carbon code. I'm going to focus on the woodland carbon code. It is actually the most stringent code in the world, or at least that's how it feels, and that's how the UK government view it. It has a clearly defined, measured and certified additional benefit. So it is something that goes above and beyond. You're not allowed to offer an offset from a woodland that's going to happen anyway. It has to show that it's going to do more than just, it's going to do a load of good, and then it's going to go that extra mile and hit these carbon targets. Projects, you have to register them. So we take a woodland, we design it, we do a load of calculations, and we register it on a public register. Once that's on there, we then plant that woodland up, and we have to send a load of our calculations, our designs, and sort of other evidence off to an independent validator. They will then look at that and validate our project to confirm that our woodland has been done to the standard and will produce a carbon offset. At that point, if that's all gone to plan, you are issued pending issuance units. So these are not carbon units, they're not carbon credits. They are a certificate, a valid and genuine certificate that says you have bought basically a carbon future. You have bought a ton of carbon when it is sequestered in the future. So it is a certificate that gives you exclusivity over that carbon in the future. Those can be sold. So yes, you can buy them and they're assigned to you. And as Chantelle said, once they're assigned to you, that's it. There's no onward trading. They're yours and they will be retired in your name. Woodlands don't go carbon positive until about 10 years out. They hit just above being carbon neutrality because there is carbon involved in the planting of woodland. And it's not until 15 years out that you start to see those pending issuance units, those PIUs, become woodland carbon units. And and that is the point at which you can claim the offset. And every 5 to 10 years after that, more units are released. So it's really important to highlight, you cannot say that you are carbon neutral when you've bought PIUs. You can make a statement that says, I have committed to carbon neutrality at this point, but through the purchase of PIUs. You can talk about commitment, but you cannot say that you are carbon neutral or that you have offset carbon simply through the purchase of PIUs. This is a quick graph about the sequestration of rate of a hectare of woodland. And here you can see that there's this rapid period from 20 years to about 45, 50 years of sequestration, and then it slows out. But you have to be patient is really what I'm trying to show here. But in being patient, you need to think about investing now for the future. How much carbon is available? About 800 tons of woodland carbon units. So the actual offsets are available across the country. It's probably less than that now because that's what I was told about 6 weeks ago. There are many PIUs, but landowners are sitting on them because they're watching the price going up and hearing things saying, oh, you know, carbon is going to reach £50 a tonne. So they're sitting on those PIUs and hoping that they're going to make more money in the future. And just to be clear, the woodlands that we planted back in April, they're not going to become carbon offsets or offer their first carbon offsets until 2036. The ones we're planting this winter will not offer their carbon offsets until their first carbon offsets till 2037. Demand is extremely high. Daily phone calls from people wanting to offset, but there are mixed expectations. And I spend a lot of time just getting across this message. No, if you're looking to buy carbon in this country, you're looking at your offsets in the future, not now. Supply is very low, but growing rapidly, and hopefully the trees we plant this winter will offer plenty of opportunities. So that's my son planting his first tree. Our carbon costs are 25 to 45 pounds a tonne. That's a lot more than the market rate, but that's because we're not just planting up any old field to sell carbon. We're targeting the most benefit. It's carbon plus plus plus. Capital costs of woodland creation are separate. So it's really important that if you are going to pay for trees to be planted, that you don't claim the carbon, because you may find someone else has actually bought the carbon from the trees you planted. It actually costs 10 to 15 pounds to establish a tree. It's not just the action that Flynn's doing here of sticking it in the ground. There's all the design work, the negotiations with landowner, sorting out fencing, permits, but really importantly, looking after those trees for at least 10 years after they've been planted. We deliver with local communities. Again, Chantelle touched on that. It's so important to involve local people so that they're getting the most benefit. And they're involved in the planting and then looking after the woodland. And we blend our finances, whether that's corporate finance, whether it's government finance, or whether it's charitable finance. And some of our sites don't get registered with the Woodland Carbon Code. We just plant trees because it's the right thing to do. So my final slide, supporting UK carbon offset offers all of those benefits I listed. And as you saw through both of our presentations, they directly map onto the Sustainable Development Goals, from health and well-being to cleaner water, climate action, life below water, life on land, and that important bit at the end there, partnerships for goals. Thank you very much.
Okay, you've got me, well, sort of got me back again for a little bit. Thank you very much, Chantelle. Thank you very much, Jack. Two fabulous presentations. Taught me plenty while I was sat and watching, so thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A at the moment, and then I've got a couple of things that I've jotted down as well. Take it whoever wants to be first in, best dressed to answer. So you know what each of us skill sets are all about. The first one is from Jay Coleman. He's not indicated, so I'll just read that out, but by all means raise your hand if you'd like to. Are you able to recommend any other online measuring services? So that came in relation to measuring your carbon footprint and your emissions, Chantelle.
Oh, there are a lot that are out there. Some of them you have to pay to use. There's one by a company called Carbon Footprint. They're a massive consultancy firm, but they do a free calculator for small businesses. You just have to sign up to them. There are calculators on the SME Climate Hub. So if you join up to the Race to Zero, there's a lot of resources on there, and they do have free calculators on there as well.
And just to chime in and upsell our own services, for Lancashire-based businesses, that measuring your company carbon footprint is one of the things that we do under the Chamber Low Carbon banner. We can do it commercially for those outside of Lancashire as well, but all those websites are sort of a first in and the best dressed from a free point of view. Equally, I don't have it to hand, but I've come across sort of predetermined tools made for local authorities. Now, they do have the slant that they are more local authority based, but depending on what resources that you're actually including, there are some good access tools out there if it just takes a little bit of Google digging. But if you'd like more information, I can go back into the well and find out where I found templates such as that. Please just drop us a line and I'd be happy to do so. And Jay Coleman's second question is, if we have an area of land for planting, how can we get involved?
If you just get in touch with ourselves, Ribble Rivers Trust, you'll find our website online, and just get in touch. We can either point you to one of our partners, depending on where you're based, or we can have a look ourselves and just sort of understand what the land is, where it is, and what opportunities there are.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I'll just see if there's any more questions do want to filter in. I'll just sort of overlay, fill a bit of time. So I've got a book, Mike Berners-Lee. It is Mike, isn't it, that you put up, Chantelle? I get them, the two famous brothers, aren't they? One basically created what we're talking on now, and the other one's an extremely good climate and carbon scientist. I've got the book How Bad Is Bananas, which is another good point of reference, but the one I've got in my house, I've not updated to the new one just yet. And that original book is 2010, and that talks about a 10-ton lifestyle. Now, I think some of that would have been to do with the average as well. When you said a 5-ton, so that's an average across all the human race, isn't it? Mm. Or was that a target for everybody to get to 5?
The 5 is an average of everybody. It's like an average of global average. And in that first edition of Mike's book, the average UK adult was 15 tonnes. So in the one that got released last year, that's now 13, and that's because of the changes to the national grid. So yeah, his books are amazing, especially the How Bad Are Bananas one.
Yeah, I must admit it's criminal. I've got No Planet B on the shelf, and I only just finished the 2010 version on the recent holiday, so I've got a bit of catching up to do. But I wondered what those changes were, because I remember reading it in the context of basically, I know I'm reading it when we've moved on an awful lot. And then I did see that he's released a new one, like you say, last year. Any comments on sort of mechanical offsetting, or does that cause any problems or issue or confliction? Is the market for natural versions and resource being squeezed? Is there anything that people should maybe, even if it's not necessarily your area and you don't know much about it, it's fine, but I'm just thinking, you know, that level of information, people will go, well, why should I plant a tree, as opposed to thinking I can put it in some mechanical version? What are the pitfalls maybe people could come across from going down a different route?
I don't know if you want to go first, Chantelle, but I think from my perspective, the wider benefit and the need for more trees beyond just sequestering carbon says that's what we should be looking at first. But, you know, there is only so much land and we need it for a range of purposes. So I don't think you can say only do natural, only focus on natural. It's about, well, right now that to me would obviously be the priority, and I'm biased, but at some point we will probably have to look and consider more mechanical means.
Right, thank you. Sorry, Chantelle, have you got? I thought I was cutting over you then.
I was just going to add that obviously the natural solutions have much wider benefits, as Jack said, but one thing that is going to start developing is carbon capture. So the technology is there to an extent where, if you think of a manufacturing factory, they can actually put a filter on top of the chimneys where they're burning things. They capture the CO2 and store it, and that can either be used for things like, as we've got the CO2 crisis at the moment, it can be used for fizzy drinks, things like that, or it can actually be stored underground. It can be bored into hard rock, so it's fully locked away, but it's very expensive at the moment. But all of these things start off expensive, and then as they get more popular and people start to stipulate that they have to be done, and whether that's a government level or in procurement, the price will come down, it'll become more available. So we need that mix of the mechanical side and the price to come down, but never forgetting that, yes, plant trees, the CO2, but it's so much bigger than just CO2 aspect with the tree planting.
Yeah, oh, fantastic, thank you. One more from me. I picked up on Jack's. It's like the age-old thing of developers sitting on land and they don't want to develop it until, you know, put flats or gentrify it and shut the 200-year-old pub. Sounds like we're doing that with trees at the moment, doesn't it? Is there a way of stimulating the market? What tools are available to sort of, can we break down those barriers? Can you go down your route? Do you know what I mean? To try and open up, and obviously, rather than it being a solely capitalist-based thing, what could happen, even if it's out of our control, to stimulate people sitting on stuff just because they're, you know, waiting for the money?
I think that's a really big and complicated question. I think it's sort of beyond money, it starts to become regulatory. You know, money is the sort of the carrot, and then more policy and regulatory will come in. I think, you know, the adoption of biodiversity net gain and high targets around that will help when developers do start to look at development. But I think it's I suppose almost as an avoiding of the question, but or answering the question, but kind of a slightly different one is, I heard a great quote the other day, is that the environment is not a subsidiary of the economy. The economy is a subsidiary of the environment, and we need to make sure that we recognise that. So I think one of the things we're really keen to see is actually a proper land strategy. So it's not just where are we going to plant trees, where are we going to build houses. It's actually looking at all of the demands that we place on our land and trying to sort of highlight where there are best places for best things. At the moment for development, it's sort of the least worst through the sequential test. But really we should be actually saying, well, where are the best places for all these different land uses, and then rewarding people appropriately for where that happens. I think there is a genuine sort of moral sort of shift as well. People starting to really recognise they need to do the right thing, you know, and that's business as well. And I think, you know, it does sort of come back to money, but Chantelle's point around, you know, customers demanding, you know, it is really going to be sort of a driver.
Thank you very much. I'll just scan if there's anything else in the Q&A. So I would say we've got those answered. They're the two from before. I think that's it. If there's anything else that either of you would like to add or pick up on.
No,
I think
not
just
for me.
yeah, just reiterate what Chantelle said. Do your 10%. It's not hard. It's not a big amount, but all these little bits help.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. So it's just for me to wrap up. If we don't have any further questions, I'd like to thank Chantelle and Jack for the time, expertise and insights today. I think we can all agree they were two excellent speakers and two brilliant presentations. Lots of informative information that you can take away. So thanks very much both for that. Really appreciate your time and connecting with us. Just to wrap up properly about future events, if you look at the Chamber Low Carbon website or our Eventbrite site, you'll see that we've got one more showing at the moment, and that's a circular economy event, and that is next week, and that is a hybrid event. I think if you go on, it'll direct you about the tickets and whatnot, but we're having some people in the room, and we're also having the opportunity for you to sit on the couch with your shorts on underneath the screen. We will be having some things in and around COP as well, so if you keep your eyes on the social medias, they're not listed out as it stands or when I last checked before the event, so we are going to be doing lots of promotional stuff in and around COP in various different ways and events as well, so please just keep a lookout for that, and the news will tell you when that conference is going on if you forget about it. So you've also got the sort of the double edge there to remind you about COP. And that's pretty much it. So thank you very much for your time and attending. Thank you to our speakers, and we'll hopefully see and speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.